Hello, can you hear me okay? Testing one, two. Fantastic. All right, my name is Hunter, and this is content review for Principles of Biology students 212. Today we're doing circulation. We're moving away from plants, we're moving towards humans and non-human animals, which is my favorite. So, circulation, of course, is the heart, the movement of blood throughout the body. We'll get a little bit into metabolism and uh, getting nutrients and waste products where they need to be. So, first exercise here. How is mammalian heart structure related to function? Diagram and describe the path a red blood cell takes from a capillary in your big toe to your heart and back to your big toe. And at each point in the pathway, indicate whether the red blood cell is most likely picking up or losing oxygen. Indicate also the relative blood pressure that part of the path is likely to have, and include all of the following terms in your diagram. Uh, we're just going to kind of run through this. I will check things off either at the end or as we go. We could spend the entire hour on this diagram and it would be worthwhile. If you are planning on working in a clinical environment, this is absolutely fundamental um, to that education. All right. So we're asked to start at the big toe, and we have to first orient ourselves to a diagram. I'm going to go with the one on our right, and I'm going to label it first. When we're working on patients, we always orient to patients left and right. So it's backwards from our perspective. So, and I'm labeling this because I will get it wrong at some point. Actually. Okay, starting at the big toe, we see we have some lungs. Not starting at the big toe, we have some lungs. We have a heart in the middle, and then we have this web-like appearance. I'm using this diagram that's color-coded because it gives us some hints to the oxygenation at these different places in the circuit. So if our big toe is down here, what we have is a capillary bed. And I'm going to do this. Yeah, I'll stick with black. Capillaries, depending on which side of the circuit you're on, may be called arterioles feeding those capillaries, or venules. And I'm going to write this off to the side. Venules and arterioles. This will make more sense in a second. I'm going to come back to it. So red blood cell in our big toe flows through the venules into a vein and then into the heart. And it flows into the heart at the right atrium. Um, a way to remember this, right atrium, atrium is a word meaning entryway. You can simply remember it that way. Um, and a ventricle is venting out. So anything leaving the heart goes out through a ventricle. Anything entering the heart comes in through an atrium. RV, ventricle. I'm going to zoom in here so we can see a little bit better. So this space right here is your right atrium, and below that is your right ventricle. At this point, the red blood cell's been hanging out in the rest of our body. It has given off its oxygen to whatever tissues needed it. It is deoxygenated. We got to put oxygen back on that hemigroup. So it's going to flow out and into the lungs following the pulmonary circuit. So this is the pulmonary artery. Cell hangs out in the lungs, gets oxygen diffuses through the alveoli into a capillary in the lungs where our blood cell is hanging out. That blood cell picks up that oxygen, passes out through the pulmonary vein back into the heart at the left atrium. Let me clean this up just a little bit. So whether we're in the systemic circuit, that is the circuit to the rest of the body, or the pulmonary circuit, pulmonary meaning of the lungs, vein means towards the heart, and artery means out of the heart or away from the heart. And I've color coded these again for the purpose of that oxygenation bit. Once it comes out of the lungs, out that pulmonary vein back into the left atrium, passes into the left ventricle, and then out to the aorta and the rest of the body. We're going to call this the aorta. We could also call this an artery. The aorta is the big artery coming right out of the heart. It branches in a couple of places. Well, we'll come back to that. The aorta branches, that part is important, into arteries, arterioles, and then capillaries. And we're back where we started. Let's check our list. So the aorta is the big one coming out of the heart. Venules are those tiny veins feeding from capillaries back towards the heart. Veins feed towards the heart. Arteries away from the heart. Arterioles, the really tiny, tiny arteries that feed capillary beds. Capillaries we talked about. Right atrium is on the receiving side of the heart. Left atrium is on the pulmonary receiving side of the heart. Right ventricle on the receiving side of the heart towards the pulmonary circuit. Left ventricle from the heart to the aorta and the rest of the body. Coronary arteries. These are important. Coronary arteries are the blood vessels that supply the heart with the blood that it needs to function. The heart is a muscle. It needs oxygen just like all the other tissues, and so it has its own blood supply. This is distinct from the circuit that we just drew, the one that we just talked about. So, supply heart muscle. I'm going to make that distinction with nutrients. We talked about the heart, of course. Internal organs. So in this diagram, come on now, the capillaries can be representative of the rest of the body here. There we go. My tablet's misbehaving a little bit, but it looks okay on the street, on the stream. Yes. So other internal organs like your digestive tract, like your liver, like your pancreas, all of these require blood to function as well and have their own capillary networks associated with them that branch off of the aorta. As you get into higher levels of anatomy or biology, you'll get a little more granular with this, but this is a good big picture kind of overview. And then skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is the site of blood cell formation. That happens in the marrow, which is there's a spongy marrow that fills most of your long bones, like your femur, and those contain, you don't need to remember this necessarily, but hematopoietic cells that produce what becomes, well, red blood cells and white blood cells and other components to blood. And those are super, super important. So all of these different organs work together to make form what is a connective tissue. Blood is a connective tissue um, to transport nutrients and waste products around our body. Really quickly, it's worth it. Right atrium, right ventricle. We have, this is the, I'm going to do this properly. Vena cava. We have pulmonary artery. I'm going to draw this in blue. We're going to come back. No, we're not. So blood comes in the vena cava into the right atrium, pushes to the right ventricle, where it goes out to the pulmonary artery, through the lungs, and I want to redraw this so that it actually makes sense. Not quite. Through the lungs, into that pulmonary vein. It's oxygenated at this point into the left atrium. To the left ventricle, to the aorta and the rest of the body. And that is your basic circuit. We have a couple more structures here that are unlabeled. These are the valves between chambers. This one here, I think, is the tricuspid. Yes. This one here is the mitral valve. And unlabeled, but this is the pulmonary valve. I think we'll call that good. Yeah. Good to know that you have the superior and inferior vena cava. Superior just means on top of, inferior means below. Inferior vena cava is blood towards the heart from the lower half of the body, and superior is from the upper. And you have the ascending aorta and the descending aorta. Same rationale. Ascending feeds the top half of the body, descending feeds the lower part of your body. Gravity is a factor here in blood pressure. Blood pressure, we should talk about blood pressure. Blood pressure is highest when at the point where the blood leaves the heart. Your pipes are nice and wide. That side of the heart is very muscular. I'm actually going to highlight this. You can see this shaded area of the heart is much thicker on the left side, what is our right, than it is on the right side of the heart. And that is because it has to push that blood a lot further. It has to push it through the entire systemic circuit. So the walls of the heart are literally thicker on that side, and the walls of arteries are also thicker because they need to be resilient to that pressure. Veins are very thin by comparison. Importantly, we'll get into this again a little bit later, but those membranes being very thin facilitate gas diffusion across those membranes. So you're getting oxygen out and carbon dioxide and other waste products into the veins. And this is especially true in your capillaries, where that cross section is very, very small. So there's a lot more surface area per volume than in an artery, which has these very thick walls, less surface area per volume. You can't even see that vein, artery, and cross section. Okay, that was a lot of information. And again, these recordings will be posted to the PSU Learning Center YouTube channel so that you can review these. This is worth spending some time on. Let's move on because I will spend the entire hour here, and we've already burned 16 minutes. All it says, the degree of musculature differs in these chambers of the heart, the atria, the right ventricle, and the left ventricle. Draw the heart and its chambers, including the difference in musculature. Same diagram drawn for us. Include in your description the functions of the sinoatrial node, SA node, the AV node, and the AV and semilunar valves. So I called this the tricuspid valve, but this is the AV valve, atrioventricular, between atrium and ventricle. Let's do purple. So the sinoatrial node is a bundle of, well, it's the site of electrical activity that tells the heart to contract, right? Um, to tell it to pump. There's a delay between the sinoatrial node and the AV node, the atrioventricular node, which is, we're just going to draw a rough circle there. The reason for that delay is you don't want them to squeeze at the same time, because then blood can't move in and out effectively where it's supposed to go. That delay allows for the flow from the atrium into the ventricle and out. I'm not writing a whole lot of this, but I hope that I hope that makes sense. Valves are important because they facilitate one-way movement of blood through the chambers of the heart. Backflow would be bad. That's called a heart murmur because it makes a little bubbling sound. And you can hear it with a stethoscope. So just in blue here, we have, again, the tricuspid valve here. We have the pulmonary valve there. We have, what did we say that was? The mitral valve here, and then exit to the heart here. So far, so good. Okay. Yeah. So the important thing to remember about the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node is that there is a delay between the triggers to contract, and that delay facilitates movement of blood through those chambers, so that you don't have backflow. Yeah, there are lots of medications exist that will mess with that timing a little bit. Beta blockers are an example, um, in order to slow down the heart rate if it's going crazy and you don't want it to. It's also good treatment for high blood pressure because slowing the rate lowers pressure. We'll talk about that too. All right, so while in utero, the wall between the two atria of the human fetal heart is not complete. An opening, the foramen ovale, allows blood from the two atria to mix. Now, normally at birth, this hole seals over and the two atria are separated from each other, what would be the consequences to the infant if this hole did not seal? Yeah. So basically, what we're talking about is a leak between atria, right? If this doesn't seal, oxygenated blood from the lungs in that left atrium would mix with the deoxygenated blood in the right atrium. And this condition is called blue baby syndrome because your baby literally turns blue because the oxygen, or sorry, because the blood going to the rest of the circuit isn't carrying all of the oxygen that it needs because we have this mixing happening. Blood going to the body carries less oxygen than normal, and as a result, the baby turns blue during times of higher metabolic activity, especially, which requires greater amounts of oxygen input per unit time. So just hanging out, very lethargic, might be okay, at least able to supply tissues with enough oxygen so that the baby doesn't die, but certainly not enough for normal activity. One of the most common congenital defects of the cardiovascular system is called transposition of the great arteries. And in infants who have this defect, the pulmonary artery exits from the heart where the aorta should, and the aorta exits where the pulmonary artery should. All other circulatory connections are normal. Let's draw our heart here. So we have, excuse me, right atrium and right ventricle. And we have left atrium, left ventricle. Whoop. I'm going to draw a normal circuit first. So we have, actually, give me my pen. Left vent to the lungs, to the atrium, to the body. Yes. So that's a normal circuit. You can see that. Okay. What we're breaking here is this right here. And we're going to the body instead. The problem with this should be fairly apparent. We just have a circle, right? Where deoxygenated blood is going in the right atrium, out the right ventricle, to the rest of the body, where it's further deoxygenating back into the right atrium. That would be a problem, right? Um, if unresolved, this is going to result in death. Um, and similarly, you have, instead of going out the left ventricle to the rest of the body, you just go back and forth between the lungs and the left side of the heart, which is a bad time. So there's your diagram. What type of treatment would such an infant need? So if we have, I actually want to redraw that. So we have our faulty circuit. The solution is actually the problem that we named in the previous question. We simply open, what color should I make this? We'll make it bright green. we simply open a hole between the right atrium and the left atrium, and that allows mixing between those two circuits. It's not ideal, but you are going to get some oxygenated blood from the lungs back into circulation. Yeah, unless something's done immediately following birth, the infant will die. And an operation to reverse the arteries takes a relatively long time. So in the short term, the physician opens the foramen ovale to allow at least some oxygen to be pumped to the rest of the body. Just buy you some time. All right, how are heart and lung structure and function related to metabolic rate? Describe the simplest type of closed circulatory system, include the function of each part of the system, and explain how the structure of each part is related to its function. Excuse me. We have our heart, which acts as a pump. It's very muscular, right? Pumps blood to arteries. The arteries branch into arterioles and into capillaries. Capillaries are the site of where most gas exchange occurs. Oxygen leaves those blood cells and goes into the tissue. CO2 and other waste products move into the blood. So from the capillaries, the blood continues into venules, into veins, back to the heart. I mentioned it earlier, but it's worth making special note of it here again. Arteries are more muscular. They are resisting or responding to greater pressure from that output from the heart, especially the closer it gets to the heart, right? Veins, but especially capillaries. Have very thin membranes. Battery, better for diffusion. Capillaries can be one cell wall thick. They're very, very itty bitty and allow for that diffusion. All right. If you want to increase the rate of metabolism in an organism, you need to increase A, the rate of food and oxygen delivery to the cells or to the body, and B, the rate of removal of waste products from the cells or the body. In the evolution of vertebrates, what modifications of the circulatory system specifically and or circulatory function have occurred to increase metabolic rate? This is my very cheesy illustration of a fish. Fish have a two-chambered heart. And they have gills. Blood from the heart goes to the gills where it's oxygenated, to the rest of the body where it's deoxygenated, back to the heart. Very simple in and out. One atrium, one ventricle, right? That little heart has to produce a lot of pressure to push the blood through that entire circuit. And it's basically, the blood pressure is basically zero as you get furthest away from the heart. It's not terribly efficient, right? It's very direct, but it's not terribly efficient. As we as we as we get further along in the geologic time scale and organisms have started to evolve, they're getting bigger, metabolic demands are increasing, leaving the water, right? Amphibians and a lot of reptiles have a three-chambered heart. Come on, lungs, the rest of the body. So we have a similar situation where we have a ventricle pushing to the lungs and to the rest of the body. Back to an atrium. But we also have, excuse me, we also have another atrium directly from the lungs to the heart. And that is allowing some mixing, kind of like that previous example that we talked about. That's allowing some mixing of the deoxygenated with the oxygenated blood so that you have more oxygen getting to the rest of the circuit, right? And as we've been talking about, I'm going to label this actually. Amphibians and some reptiles. Crocodilians are excluded, birds are excluded. Remembering that birds are reptiles, they are extant dinosaurs. Extant meaning still living. Right? And then we have mammals, which includes humans and puppies. And actually, I don't know if y'all can see my puppy. She's been taking a very quiet nap this entire time. Um, Mammals essentially have two hearts, right? How do I want to draw this? I'll take up the whole space. And I'm drawing this as a figure eight for a reason. Because we have these two hearts with these four chambers, two atria, two ventricles, we get this cyclical figure eight kind of movement of blood throughout the body, which is very efficient at moving oxygen and other sources of fuel to the tissues where it needs to go, and similarly moving CO2 and other waste products out. Birds and mammals essentially have two hearts. Yep. There's no mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, and as a result, higher levels of oxygen can be delivered per unit time to the cells or the body, and a higher level of metabolism can be maintained. Um, Hummingbirds are kind of a funny, like I mentioned earlier, organisms were getting bigger and bigger, and metabolic demands were increasing. The metabolism of a hummingbird is crazy, crazy, crazy fast. So, size is not the only determining factor there. It's also energy demand due to activity and other processes, right? All right. Both reptiles and mammals obtain their energy via aerobic respiration. I'm going to highlight this because this is a formula that you will see often in your science education. It behooves you to recognize it. It's glucose plus oxygen. That's supposed to be arrows going back and forth, not an S, I think. Actually, no. That's just supposed to be an arrow or a symbol. I'm not sure what that S is doing there. Um, CO2 is a waste product, water is a waste product, ATP is the product of interest, the currency of the cell. Um, Both also need to be able to maintain internal homeostasis in order to survive. Given this, would you expect the lungs of the lizard, an ectotherm, to have more or less alveoli per unit area than the lungs of the rat, an endotherm. Assume the overall surface area per volume ratios of the rat and lizard are about the same, and explain the physiological reasoning behind your answer. Alveoli, remember, are these kind of membranous structures that look like bundles of grapes that are inside your lungs that interface with the capillaries um, to facilitate that gas exchange between the air and the blood. Right. So, given this, would you expect the lungs of the lizard to have more or less alveoli per unit area? The key words here is actually ectotherm versus endotherm. Ectotherm is its homeostatic temperature is more similar to its environment. Ecto outside. So its metabolic demands are generally lower. Like we humans are generally warmer than the environment that we live in, generally speaking. That the same is not true for reptiles. Right? So, sorry, losing the plot a little bit. Lizards have fewer alveoli per unit area of lung tissue than, say, a rat. Um, Similar to humans, the rat's normal body temperature is generally higher than the environment, and its enzymes to maintain homeostatic function. Enzymes are functional at this higher temperature. Maintaining this higher body temperature requires higher levels of cellular respiration. So, ectotherm means lower or slower metabolism, which leads to fewer alveoli per unit area. Endotherms have a higher metabolism, greater energy demands to maintain that higher body temperature, needs more alveoli. On average, would you expect the heart rate of the lizard to be higher or lower than the heart rate of the rat? And explain the physiological reasoning behind your answer. Kind of the same rationale, right? If we need more surface area in the lungs to exchange those nutrients and waste products, then we also want to get those nutrients and waste products around the body faster if we have higher metabolic demands. So more pumping of the unit, more pumping of the heart per unit time gives you better or more efficient fuel and waste product exchange throughout the body. Based on your knowledge of surface area to per volume ratios, metabolic rates, and cardiopulmonary physiology, would you expect the following to be higher or lower for a human infant as compared to an adult? And explain the physiological reasoning behind your answers. With body temperature, I don't love how this question is phrased with respect to body temperature. This is really about surface area per volume ratios and less about the actual physiological body temperature, right? We need our body temperature to be pretty much the same throughout our life cycle. Um, Small deviations are fine. Um, Once we get above like 104, 106 degrees for any period of time, proteins start to denature, enzymatic activity starts to break down, which is why fevers are a major problem. Um, Being cold for long enough is also a problem, but for different reasons, right? The piece here about body temperature is even though I have much more surface area than a tiny baby, I also have a lot more volume per surface area. Uh, there's a very simple quantitative way to represent this, right? And surface area per volume is, what we're talking about. For the same, come on now, for a similar amount of surface area, 1 to 1, right? If I have a lot more area, 1/4 is objectively smaller than 1, right? Um, that's supposed to be volume. The reason I'm setting it up this way is because, the question kind of gives us our answer in many ways. This is a quantitative way of explaining this thing that we observe, which is babies lose body heat a lot faster than fully grown adults do. So body temp is lost across surface area because an infant has a much higher surface area per volume ratio than an adult. An infant will tend to lose heat much more rapidly than an adult. So to compensate for that, heart rate is going to be, well, let's look at, we'll come back to heart rate. So oxygen consumption rate per unit mass of body. Similar reasoning. So to maintain a constant body temperature, the infant's going to require a higher metabolic rate, right? They're not grown, they don't have a bunch of energy stores, they don't have the volume maintaining that temperature. So heart rate and oxygen consumption are going to be much, much higher. To give you a kind of uh, quantitative aspect to this, um, if an infant that weighs less than 20 pounds um, requires about 900 calories per day. And if adults consumed calories at this rate, this is to maintain like normal healthy growth. If adults consumed calories at this rate, a 200-pound human would require 9,000 calories per day, which would be a pretty prodigious amount of food um, to have to consume. So babies have one job, and that is eating and growing, and they're very, very good at it. Um, Sorry, having a moment of like warm fuzzy memories from my time working at Dornbecker Children's Hospital. It's yeah, yeah. Professional baby was a term that got thrown around a lot as a like baby's doing a good job doing what a baby does. Okay, at rest. How are we doing on time? We got 16 minutes. At rest, an average human's mean arterial blood pressure is 120/80. As a person increases their activity, however, a variety of physiological modifications must be made to support the increased activity. For example, assume you are late for an exam and run 4 blocks to get there on time. Which of the following would occur during your 4 block run and indicate whether the following statements are true or false? Explain your reasoning. As you run, your muscles will require more oxygen per unit time than when walking. This is true. Active muscles require more ATP per unit time, and as a result, more oxygen per unit time for cellular respiration. So more ATP demands, more oxygen demands per unit time. The percentage of carbon dioxide in your blood will increase and your blood pH will increase. This is false. It is true that there will be higher levels of CO2 in the blood. This is the problem. Higher levels of carbon dioxide will produce higher levels of carbonic acid, which will reduce blood pH, making it more acidic. Increased CO2 leads to increased carbonic acid, which is increased acidity, which is decreased pH. You have seen these pH tables before in your other classes, I hope, and they are going to keep coming up. So really, really understanding the relationship between increased and decreased acidity with decreased and increased pH is really, really important. You have to be fluent in this. All right. Your mean arterial blood pressure will increase because both the heart rate and stroke volume will increase. This is true. To increase the rate of delivery of both food and oxygen to the muscles, both heart rate and stroke volume will increase. Refer to the dissociation curves for two mammalian hemoglobins to answer the following questions. We have percent saturation of hemoglobins with oxygen, and we have partial pressure of oxygen or oxygen tension. Okay. At oxygen tension T0, both hemoglobins have released most of their oxygen. True or false? This appears to be true. Whoop. The percent saturation of both hemoglobins is near zero on this graph at T0. Okay. Yeah. Percent saturation, partial pressure. Okay. At oxygen tension T1, hemoglobin B is carrying less oxygen than hemoglobin A. I'm going to highlight this in red. Hemoglobin B is carrying less oxygen than hemoglobin A. True or false? This is false. Hemoglobin B has a higher percent saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen at T1 compared to A. B, A. Higher percent. True or false? If comparison of curves A and B illustrates the Bohr effect on a single species, then curve B represents the dissociation at the higher concentration of carbon dioxide, that is, lower pH. At lower pH with more carbon dioxide present, would oxygen be more or less likely to bind to hemoglobin is kind of what this question is asking. This one is also false. At higher carbon dioxide levels or lower pH, that is increased acidity, you'll expect the hemoglobin to release more of its oxygen to the active tissues. More activity, more waste product also needs more nutrients, right? So we want the hemoglobin off, we want the oxygen off the hemoglobin and in the tissues, right? So at high CO2 concentrations or low pH, hemoglobin, HB, will release more oxygen to active tissues. Therefore, curve A is a better representation of what happens at low pH. Curve A better represents low pH conditions. Okay. In addition to carbon dioxide, contracting muscle cells produce a large amount of heat energy. And it's been demonstrated that an increase in temperature, independent of carbon dioxide levels, encourages the blood to give up its oxygen to exercising tissues. Given this information, would you expect A or B below to be true? Explain your answers. Curve A from the previous page would be the lower temperature curve, and B would be the higher temperature curve, is option A. And option B is curve B from the previous page would be the lower temperature curve, and A would be the higher temperature curve. It's independent of CO2 concentration, independent of acidity, which of these represents the higher temperature? If an increase in temperature encourages blood to give up its oxygen. Which one has lower oxygen at the same time? Curve B would be correct. And again, in comparison, curve A releases more of its oxygen at the same partial pressures of oxygen compared to curve B. Curve B is the low temperature curve. I don't know if it was named in the worksheet, but this is a phenomenon called cooperative binding of oxygen to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin can bind, I think it's 4, more than one oxygen molecule at a time. And as it binds more oxygen, its affinity for oxygen increases. And the opposite is also true. As it drops one of those 4 oxygen molecules, it is more likely to drop the next one. And this sigmoidal curve, this S-shaped curve, is a representation of that. I think that's all I have for you for today. Feel free to email me with questions. Submit your worksheets by the deadline on Friday, and you can find the recordings on YouTube. I hope to see you next week. If you haven't taken them already, good luck with your midterms. Take care. I'll see you soon.